My father did not know that Jesus' clothes had become brilliant white, nor that his face had changed and shone with the Spirit of God. He did not know that Moses and Elijah had talked with Jesus on the small mountain that rose out of the plain where we stood among his disciples. We would learn that later. The man speaking was in his early 30s. He had unkempt brown hair and the untidy beard of a traveler. He was neither tall nor short, nor hefty nor small. The 36 men around him were armed like fortresses. Some of them glanced from time to time at the left side of his face. Some stared openly. Before anything else, I remember my father stooping among his vines and cutting bunches of fat, dark purple grapes. He would do this from sun up to sundown. He paused only to wipe the sweat from his face with the back of his big hand, or to gaze at his young wife and his little boy. Sometimes he lifted his eyes to heaven to praise God, who had given him all things needed for life and happiness. He and my mother would teach me the words of Scripture, which they too had learned as children. They taught me Joshua's words. But if you don't wish to serve the Lord, then today choose whom you will serve, the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you stand. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Things changed. In my 7th winter, Father and I were in our small stone house. He was talking to me about planting and reaping. I suddenly became unaware of him, or of anything else. This lasted for only a short time. Afterwards, I did not know that anything had happened. These things started to come often. My parents began to watch for them. Then, in the harvest season of the same year, Father and I were walking among the hanging grapes. He was showing me how to know when to take the bunches from the vines. He pointed out the color. He taught me to crush a grape between my finger and thumb to tell its firmness. He had me chew a grape to measure its thick juiciness. He told me what to expect when I tasted the flavor in its skin. We walked between rows of grapes. He became aware that I had not kept up with him. He found me on the ground between 2 rows of vines. I shook. My mouth foamed, and I was grinding my teeth. He was afraid. When I stopped shaking and foaming, he carried me in his arms to our small house. I put my arms around his neck. I cried because my head hurt so much. After that, this unclean spirit seized me so often that I did not cry, even when I would fall and strike my head. My father took me to physicians, but they did not help. I grew worse. In my 9th year, I was alone in our house when it happened again. When I came to myself, I tried to stand, but my legs wobbled. I lurched for the table to keep from falling. As I did that, my hand hit the table and upset a clay pot. It fell to the floor. I saw it break into pieces, but I heard nothing. My little mother rushed into the house when she heard the pot break. In terror, I pointed it to my ears and told her I could not hear. I could not even hear myself tell her that. I saw her press her fists to her cheeks. She opened her mouth wide as if she were wailing. 6 months later, my father gestured to me to come with him to the fields while he trimmed the vines to give the growing grapes more sun. I followed him, but as we walked, I suddenly lost track of where we were going. I tried to call my father, but I could not form the words. When I could not cry out to my father, I tried to cry out to God. I could not do that either. I sat where I was in silent fright. After a time, my father came back to look for me. I looked up into his tired eyes, and I pointed to my mouth. I shook my head. He understood. He kneeled and hugged my head to his chest. Every year my father took a lamb or a goat to the local priest to offer to God. He could not afford that. We went without, so that he could make these sin offerings. The priest would tie the legs of the lamb or goat. He would hold shut its mouth as he cut deeply into its throat. Afterwards, I was still deaf and mute, and the spirit still tormented me. I was 12 when a stranger came. It was winter. My father was sitting cross-legged under an oak tree. The stranger was about 40 years old, 8 years older than my father. He was dressed in a costly linen tunic and a brown wool coat embroidered with green designs above its fringe. My father stood as the stranger approached. The stranger drew up to my father. He said, "I have heard of your son's suffering. I am a father. You are a father. I ask you, would you accept my help for the sake of your son's well-being, even though I am a stranger to you?" My father looked at him with curiosity and hope. He said, "Yes, I would." They sat down together. The stranger asked to see me. My father brought me out to him. When he saw me, the stranger snaked his tongue between his upper and lower lips. My mother brought bread and a stew made with lentils and set them before this man. After he had put down the empty bowl, the stranger said, "I am from a village to the north. I have always been troubled when I see suffering like your son's. I am troubled that there is no help for it." My father studied the man's face. The man continued, "I worship the Lord like you do, but I have made a careful study of suffering like your son's suffering, and like your own. After years and much prayer, I have learned things. Painfully, this is what I have learned. Our God has no power over demons like the one that harms your son. This is also plain. The God we worship has a deep love for people like you and your family. Ours is a good God. In truth, this love runs deeper than his jealousy. As I said, I am from the north. I know the men from beyond Galilee, men from Tyre and Sidon. I know their cleverness. I know their skill at building, at sailing, at trading. I know the wealth of their cities." With a shrug, he gestured at our rustic stone house. Then he gestured at me. "I know a man. He has power to call on the God from the north, the Baal of Tyre and Sidon. This Baal is a clever god, like the men of Tyre and Sidon are clever. I promise you this, if you and your house would only worship Baal, then this priest would call upon Baal for you. He would make your son well, and also, if you worship this clever god of these clever people, then you will prosper and grow rich like the men of Tyre and Sidon." My father stood up. The stranger stood too. The stranger quickly said, "Of course, you can still worship God, but for your son's sake, remember the great love of God which makes him welcome help from other gods to heal his beloved people." My father raised his voice and told the stranger to go. Spittle flecked his beard. As he left, The stranger shouted over his shoulder, "Think of what I have said. Think, after you have thought, you will see me again." My suffering continued. One day the unclean spirit seized me next to the pond on my father's vineyard. I fell into the pond. It was good fortune that sometimes I would scream without being aware of it when the demon entered me. That happened next to the pond. My father heard and came running. He pulled me out of the water. Later, I fell into the water again. After that, I had to stay away from the water. As he had promised, the stranger came back. After the vines had bled, he came back with another man. They came while my father was alone in the vineyard, inspecting new buds. This time, the first stranger stayed silent. The other man spoke. He was older, gray, and gaunt. He asked after my welfare. My father said little, but he did not tell them to go away. The man said, "Listen, my friend was wrong. Consider your son. Consider history. Consider how hard you work to wrest your livelihood from the ground. The God you worship is a powerful God, but he is not a loving God. Think on the famous wealth of the cities to the north. Baal and Astarte are the gods of these cities of Tyre and Sidon. These gods are kind. They are generous. They would save your son, even if your own indifferent God will not." My father did not yell at them. He asked them to leave. The stranger said, "Remember King Solomon. He built altars to Astarte. It is she that I speak of. You are a grape grower. Are you wiser than King Solomon?" They left, but they promised to come back. One night, shortly after that, my father and a neighbor made a fire between their vineyards to burn vine debris. As I watched flames leap into the air from the dead vegetation, I was seized by the unclean spirit. I plunged into the fire. My father pulled me out. He burned his hands, feet, and forearms. I have the scars that you see. The strangers returned one evening shortly before the Feast of the Tabernacles. They brought a third stranger. His red robe and black cloak were unadorned. He was older than the other two. His white hair and beard were storm-like. His eyes penetrated. My father sat under the oak with his back against it. These three strangers stood on three sides of him. The third stranger stood directly in front of father. As he spoke, the others bowed their heads. He said, "I am a priest and an oracle. These men can tell you that the future is revealed to me, and I can tell you something about your son." My father stood. The oracle continued, "If nothing changes, your son will not live to the end of the grape harvest." My father's eyes widened. He walked away from the men for about a dozen steps, paused, then turned around and came back. He said, "Give me 7 days to think." The oracle said, "It might already be too late." My father said, 7 days, please." Father spoke with my mother. He laid before her what the oracle had said. She was silent for a time. Then she said, "I am tired like you are tired, and I am afraid like you are. You should go to a teacher, to a scribe, not the one in our village. He has no answers that have helped. Go to a larger town, Nain perhaps. If the teacher there has a solution, fine. Otherwise, it might be time to make peace with our son's affliction. They looked at each other's faces for half a minute, then my father nodded his head. My father and I left for Nain. It was over half a day of steady walking before we saw Nain and the low hill behind it. Men in the synagogue told my father how to find the town's scribe. He was a blacksmith. My father found the scribe's house in part by following the directions that the men in the synagogue had given him. But after a time the clang of metal on metal told him where to go. From a distance he saw the scribe was at his forge under a sheltering roof held up by 4 posts. He was raising his hammer and smashing it down. Every so often he would thrust the piece that he was hammering into his furnace and pump the bellows. When we got closer, we saw that he was hammering a piece of metal shaped like a great bird's beak. It was a plow blade. As we walked up, he inspected the blade and plunged it into a basin of water. The scribe was a large man like my father. They were about the same age. He put his work aside and invited my father to sit with him on the grass in the shade of his house. We sat with him a dozen feet from his bellows and furnace. My father described my affliction and its history. He asked the scribe what we should do. The scribe did not answer right away. He rubbed the backs of his thick fingers against the sides of his dark beard. Then he asked my father about himself and about me. He listened keenly to my father's answers, and then he asked more questions based on what my father said. This went on for over 2 hours. Finally, the scribe asked my father if there was anything else. He invited my father to think carefully. He and my father sat silently for several minutes. Then my father answered, no. They sat in silence for another quarter hour. Then my father asked, why is this happening to my boy? The scribe sat without speaking while you might count to 10. Then he said, listen. He recited a psalm. The psalm started with questions. My God, why do you fling us away for all time? Why does your fury immolate the flock of your hand? He said, the psalm tells of how our enemies brought hatchets and hammers and fire into our temple in Jerusalem. They took the stones that made our meeting place with God, and they made those stones only stones again. Then they destroyed every other meeting place of God in the land. The psalm grieves the absence of signs, prophets, and any person who might have given us hope. Our land was deaf and mute. He glanced at me. My father lowered his head. Then the scribe said, but listen to the psalm that follows after that one. He recited the psalm that starts, we thank you, O Lord, we thank you. Your name is near. People praise your wondrous works. My father sat still. Then the scribe recited another psalm, the one that starts, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Then he asked, do you know the psalm before that one? My father thought. Then he answered, I don't remember. The scribe recited the psalm that starts, my God, why have you abandoned me? From his expression it was hard to tell what my father was thinking. Then he said, I have a psalm too. The scribe urged him, please. My father recited this, you, O God, have proved us. You have refined us like silver. You brought us into prison. You put shackles on us. You made men ride over us. We went through fire and water, but you brought us into an open space." The scribe nodded. He glanced at his bellows. Then he said, "Do this. Go to the widow who lives outside this town. Look for a house with an olive tree in front and fields of wheat behind on the road to Mount Tabor. Speak with her." The scribe said a blessing over us, and we left. We followed his directions. Outside of town, we saw the house with an olive tree. A young man saw us coming. He went inside the house and brought a woman out. When we came to them, my father said, "The teacher sent us." The woman asked, "Jesus sent you?" My father was startled. He said, "I don't know the teacher Jesus. The teacher from town sent us, the blacksmith." The widow invited us to sit next to the olive tree in the fading light. She brought out water and bread. My father described the brutality of the spirit that harmed me. The widow studied his face as he spoke. Then the widow said that Jesus had helped her and he could help us. My father asked, "Who is Jesus?" "Jesus is the man who brought my son back to life." She gestured toward the glad-seeming, curly-haired man who sat with us. He was about 17 years old, and he watched my father and me with large, keen eyes under bushy brows. My father asked, "What do you mean, brought your son back to life?" Her calm smile and wide eyes were those of a woman who is about to share a wonderful secret with a friend. "My son was dead. Now he's alive. Jesus did that." My father stared blankly at her. She leaned into my father's face so that her nose was a hand's width away from his. Her eyes were wide open. She lowered her voice. "I was on the way to bury my son. He was on a funeral bier. He was prepared for burial. His hands and feet were tied with linen strips, and his face was covered with cloth. Men were carrying him down to his grave next to the road that leads up to Nain. Women were keening behind us. I was in front. Jesus was coming up the road to the town. He and his followers met us just as we came through the town gate." She continued, "Jesus and his followers stopped and stepped aside. As I approached Jesus, he said for me not to weep. Then he walked past me to the bier and touched it. The men carrying my son stood still." Father asked, "He touched the bier?" He was surprised. The widow answered, "Yes, and then he told my son to rise," which he did. My son sat up. The men put the bier down and jumped away. They almost dropped my son. The young man grinned and nodded. He looked at my father, hovered his hands a couple of feet above the ground, then he slapped his palm down to the hard dirt. His mother continued with the story. "And Jesus took the cloth off my son's face and unbound my son's hands. As he did that, the men who had carried the bier untied the strips of cloth that bound my son's feet. Then Jesus took my son's hand, and my son stood up. Jesus led him to me. He put my son's hand in my hand. I was trembling. I could not speak, but my son was jubilant. He shouted praises into the air, even as he hugged me." Father looked at the woman, then at her son, then at me, then back at her. He asked, "Could this be true?" She said, "Listen, my son and I are getting ready to go to Mount Tabor. We leave in the morning. Jesus is there now. Come with us, and you can see for yourself." My father lowered his head and clasped the top of his head with his hands. He was silent for a time. We left for Mount Tabor when the sun rose. The weather grew warm because there were no clouds to cast shadows. On the way, Father asked the woman to tell the story of Jesus and her son again. He asked many questions. This is the end of part 1.